fails. You see, if I'm just dependent upon what I feel about someone or something, actually that can come and that can go. If I'm just left to depend upon what stimulates me emotionally, actually that's going to change as the years have unfolded and things have moved on. So what is the love that never fails? What Paul suggests is that love has to be consistent. It's got to have a firm foundation to it. What is it that it says? That love doesn't look for the wrongs in others. Love isn't self-seeking. That sort of love isn't a love, I want to suggest to you, that is just emotionally born. I want to say this morning that to love is a decision that we make. It's an intent that we have. If it's just based upon emotion, as warm and as lovely as that is, it will never be sufficient. When I was a child, says Paul, I thought like a child. When I grew up, I put away foolish things. Melvyn says, when I was a child, I loved a teddy very much. Now I would be ashamed to say that I love my teddy very much. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. If it is that we think that it's sufficient to show our love by just finding the cheapest card that we can in Tesco's, or even the most expensive card that they have in Cards R Us or whatever else they might be used, or that just to buy a bunch of flowers or to go to the local cemetery and borrow a bunch of flowers from there to display our love. Actually, if that's the extent of our love, it means very little. That's just to warn you, Hazel, there's nothing coming your way whatsoever tomorrow. Because if my love was just significant in a card or a bunch of flowers, when the flowers die, when the card no longer has any use, it has no purpose. Except if you're Hazel. When one of the things, well, Lord, one of the things when we got married and she needed to clear her house, she said to me, we'll probably need to go up into the loft because there's some things in the loft that need to be got rid of. Every card, every letter she had been sent since the age of 16 until her age now, which was there. Bags and bags and boxes of the things. Now, the only out that I have is that there were letters that she read to me from previous boyfriends, of which at least she said, I can't remember them. I wonder where it was that we went out. So there was, so if it's just dependent upon something like, it's not love. Love has to be substantive. Love has to be consistent. Love has to be in action. Jesus comes to Peter and speaks to him and speaks of a love that is not about just a warm feeling. He speaks to him of a love that confronts the past and points to a future. He speaks to him of a love that needs to be not just spoken on the lips, but has to have an action that goes with it. And so I want us to begin to explore and unpack that sort of love that God calls us to, that invites us to experience and to live in and through this morning. Both as a denomination and as a church, we're in different stages of working through that really quite controversial report that was received by conference that is called God in Love Unites Us. We've become so uncomfortable with that phrase that we've started calling it the Gilyu report, because it's easier to say than actually look at the phrase that's in the middle of it, because it's a report that asks us to live It actually says with contradictory convictions. And we're learning the pain of what that means. But I actually think there's something really significant in the title of the report, because it says God in love unites us. And that's where we've always had to stand as the Christian community. There's never been a moment in the history of Christendom when we've all agreed on the same thing. Look at the Council of Jerusalem. Look at what happened when it was that Peter had that vision of the unclean coming down from heaven and had to explain to those who were around him of Jewish Christian convictions that the very things that they've seen to be unclean, now God was saying is clean. There's always been contradictory convictions in the era of Christendom. And I don't want us to get so hot under the collar, so falling out with each other over things that we feel deeply and passionately about. And I don't want you to lose that passion. I don't want you to lose that sense of conviction of what you feel is right and correct. But I do want us to focus on the fact that God in love unites us and calls us to stand and to be with each other. So Jesus comes to Peter on the lake shore and he says, "Do you love me, Peter?" And I want to suggest that he first invites Peter and ourselves to look at "Do you love me?" means that we need to examine our priorities of what that love might really mean. John says that Jesus says, "Do you love me more than these?" And we've often pondered and wondered about what the these are. Are they the other disciples that are around about? Is it that Jesus is asking Peter whether he wants to compare himself with our Andrew or Peter or Matthew or any of the others disciples might think and feel about Jesus? Is it that Jesus is saying, actually, I need you to make comparisons about how well you're doing as opposed to others, or how badly you're doing as opposed to others? That's not the Jesus that I know and love. Jesus, the only comparison he asked me to look at is how it is that I'm comparing up to the love that he's invested in me. The only comparison that he asked me to make is to look at how deeply I'm being drawn into him. Not to look over my shoulder to see what he's doing in the hearts and the lives of somebody else. That's when division begins to really hurt the church. When we think that we're better or we're worse than anybody else. That's not the Jesus that I know. Was it that Jesus was saying to Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" And around him would have been all the paraphernalia of what it means to be a fisherman. That's what they'd been doing before this question was being asked. They'd been fishing, they'd been using their nets, they'd been toiling all night. And so Jesus, was it that he was saying to him, "Do you love me more than the paraphernalia of the things that are the tools of your trade?" I don't think that was so either. I don't think Jesus asked me to come out of the world and to step aside and be a hermit, a spiritual hermit in the world that I'm called to live in. The Jesus that I know says, as we've been referring to Jeremiah, "I've planted you sometimes in a very uncomfortable place, amongst very uncomfortable people. But I'm asking you to use the tools of your life, the tools of your trade, to speak the story that is the story of faith that has been invested in you." Or was it that Jesus was saying to Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" Maybe referring to the fact that this very event happened in close proximity to the home of Peter. Maybe it was that Jesus was saying to him, "Do you love me in this place that is most comfortable to, where you've retreated from Jerusalem, that you've come back to your old way of living, your old ways of living and your old ways of being. You've retreated into your past." That's not the Jesus I know. That says just look to the behind you. The Jesus that I know and love says that I have plans for you, to bring to you hope, to have a purpose for your life. Now, all of these things that we've spoken about, of course, are natural responses and instincts. We always seek to find the comfortable place to be. We always seek to find the ground that we're most sure on as well. But the Great Commission that Jesus had already expressed to the disciples was that they should go into the world, to move forward, to move on, to set priorities that were not about them being comfortable, was not about them being in their silo of the things that they knew best, but to go into a lost world, as Jeremiah speaks to the people of old. In a world that's unfamiliar to you, in a world where you're surrounded and influenced by secularism, and to show them a different way, the need to hear a story of love that is not about emotion, but is about intent, decision-willed love. I think, do you love me? Was a challenge to Peter, it's a challenge to me, and I hope that it's a challenge to you to examine what our priorities are. Which really, bottom line is, Jesus is saying to Peter, do you love me more than you love yourself, Peter? Do you have more confidence in me, or do you just have confidence in yourself? Do you know the God of abounding grace and mercy and love? Or do you just know the frailties of who you are and what you're about and are able to give? I think, do you love me? Also ask Peter and ask me, and I hope ask you too, to examine the principles by which we live our lives too. I mean, this really, as they gathered together on the lake shore on this morning, I think the heart of it was an act of forgiveness. Do we really think that this forgiveness was about perhaps Jesus coming and reminding Peter of how it was that Peter had denied him in the courtyard, even though that Jesus had predicted that Peter was going to deny him? Do we think that there was something of a grudge match that was going on here, where Jesus wanted to ask him, Peter, do you love me? If you did, you wouldn't have said the things that you did about me. Some sort of grudge match that sort of kept Peter in his place? Of course it wasn't. This was an act where Jesus wanted Peter to understand that his past did not need to determine what his future could be. This wasn't about Jesus humiliating Peter. And we need to be really careful as we move forward and exploring what it means for God in love unites us, that we don't use our words to try and humiliate other people in the process, because they don't quite think and believe in the same way that we do. This was primarily an act of forgiveness because Jesus knew, of course, that Peter needed to forgive himself. It wasn't that he really needed Jesus' forgiveness. That was done on the cross. But Peter did need to forgive himself, needed to come to terms with what he had said and what he'd not done. Now, I wanted to quote to you this morning a great literary artist, because sometimes, the great philosophers of this world can say, just like those kids, in a few words, what preachers try to say in 3 or 4 pages. And so I went to that font of all knowledge, Google, to find a quote that I could bring to you this morning. And it was a quote that comes from that great literist and actor known as Mo in EastEnders, who at some point quoted as saying, "If you don't forgive me, I'll give you such a kick up the jacksie that you'll meet next week before it even arrives." See, sometimes we think that we can demand forgiveness from people because in some way that's about letting ourselves off the hook. That somehow if we can deflect the fact that other people need to forgive us, somehow we don't need to look at ourselves. This concept of deflecting the blame onto the others is there right from the very beginning of time. Those of us that were at the men's breakfast, what a sexist statement that is. Those of us that were there at breakfast for which women are invited, but please don't come along because it's for men, on a Saturday morning. We're reminded by John Starlin the other week of Genesis 3, where it is, of course, you know, the story of Adam and Eve, how they're in the Garden of Eden, and how it is that God says to him, you can touch anything that you want. It's all here for your benefit. It's all here to beautify your lives. But the one thing that I ask you not to do is to take an apple from the tree of knowledge. You know the story in Genesis 3. Along comes the serpent, and the serpent sort of persuades Eve that it's okay to pick from this tree of knowledge. And she does, and she shares it with Adam. And then it says that God comes looking, and they're hiding because of their shame and their sense of embarrassment. They've covered themselves up. They're hiding in a bush. And when confronted by God, and God says to Adam, what have you done, Adam? And Adam says, she made me do it. And then Eve says, but the servant made me do it. And the serpent says, well, God said it was okay for you to have that choice. We're in the whole process of casting blame because somehow we think it lets ourselves off of the hook. And what we often forget that's right in the heart of that story is that actually it says that after they were ashamed, after they were embarrassed, after they were hiding from God, it says that God came into the garden looking for them and cried out, where are you? Where are you? You see, at the heart of forgiveness is the fact that whatever other people have done to us, whatever it is that we've done to ourselves that we think we need to blame other people, God will always come looking for us to forgive us. Because that's the nature of God. A love that is not emotional, but a love that is a being, is a presence. We were reminded right at the beginning that God so loved the world that he gave. What was his intent? That wasn't the spur of the moment thing. That wasn't an emotional response to things that were going wrong. It says from the very beginning of time, it was God's intention that he should give because he loves. Peter, even in this moment of ultimate confrontation with himself, still looks over his shoulder and says, but what about him? What about John? What's he going to do? Where's it going to end up for him? The requirement of the question to be asked 3 times was more about getting Peter to come to terms that he needed to forgive himself because he'd already been forgiven. His forgiveness was not dependent upon how he answered a question. His forgiveness was dependent upon how he responded to what God had already done. To forgive oneself is often the greater need than to forgive others. I was brought up with a little song ditty that said this: no more, no more. He remembers sins no more. They're pardoned forever. And he will never bring them up against me anymore. I'll hear no more of the evil days of yore. I'm a pardoned offender, and God will remember them no more. Jesus says to Peter, Peter, forgiveness, do you love me? It's about letting yourself off of the hook. It's not about an emotional response to me. It's about an intent and a decision that you make. For the question, do you love me, also asks us to examine what our purpose, our reason for being is. When we're forgiven, it does enable us to move on, to leave behind that which can cause us to believe we are less than the whole. Now, it is true, mistakes have consequences. And sometimes we have to live through those consequences But we do not need to live our life forever looking over our shoulders and living out our past in our tomorrows. David Harkness, in his poem, says this: you can turn your back on tomorrow because of yesterday, or you can be happy for tomorrow because of yesterday. All right? So forgiveness is God remembers no more. Now, we still do. You know, we've not yet had that blessed gift of total and complete memory loss. So what are we going to do about the mistakes of our past that we're conscious of? What Jesus says to Peter is, I need you to declare them, and I need you to leave them at the foot of the cross, because I'm going to use them in a phenomenal way in the future that you can't yet begin to understand. If you acknowledge the consequences of your past failures, of your fears, of your anxieties, if you hand them over to me, there's nothing that you can give to me that I cannot use for my glory and honor. That's what God says to Peter. And so he says, hey, I know about your past. Everybody else will know about your past, but it's not going to stop you from serving. It's not going to stop you from teaching and leading and feeding those who you're going to come, whose influence is going to come under you. This story, of course, happens by the lakeside at Galilee. There's something quite incredible that happens if you ever go to that place. There's a lovely church that's built to recognize that, of course, Jesus had prepared breakfast for the guys. It wasn't sausages and tomatoes, bacon. I don't know why we don't have fried bread, but we have potatoey things as well. It wasn't about toast and tea and coffee. It says that he prepared a barbecue for them of fish that morning, and when they ate their fish together, and there's a church there to mark where the barbecue took place. And then Jesus takes Peter and has this conversation with him. When you take tour parties to the Holy Land, something extraordinary happens in this place. You share with them about the barbecue and the meal together, and then you would just normally invite folk to say, why don't you just take your own time, just have some moments around the lakeshore. And it doesn't matter if I've gone with a group that have all come out of the one church. It doesn't matter if there's family groupings. The same thing has happened on every 7 occasions that I have been there. That when they come out of the church, people go down to the lakeside, but they never go together. You stand and watch, and everybody goes off independently. Husband and wives just separate. Brothers and sisters just separate. Church groups suddenly become individuals as people walk around the side of the lake, just reflecting on what it means. Do you love me? What does that mean for my future? What does it mean for my present? What does it mean for my past? Because God still has a purpose for me, despite what I might have been. This event happens very close to another very significant event for Peter. If you ever go to the place called Banias, it's very important. It's where the river Banias comes out of a cave. It's a tributary that eventually leads to the Jordan, which has such significance. Banias is also a place where the Greek philosophers and the Romans would go, where they had idols made particularly to the god of Pan, and in the crevices you can still see the idols that are there to the god Pan, and it's where they would go and make their sacrifices and make their offerings to the god Pan. It's a significant place for the Jewish community because it's a huge cave. It's a dark cave. It's a cave that when you look into it seems to have no end to it. It's just a big, dark, black hole that goes on forever and ever. And for the Jewish faith, they believe that at the bottom of that hole are the gates of Hades. And so they would go there to remind themselves of what they needed to escape from. So in this place at Banias, when Jesus goes with his disciples, there's a whole plethora of people, of cultures, of mixtures. They're all there for different reasons and for different motivations. And it's in this place that Jesus had no need to go to. It wasn't on the normal route that he would take around Galilee. He goes with his disciples, and standing in the midst, I have no doubt, of these people who are making sacrifices, who are making offerings, who were going through their own religious rituals. He says to Peter, he says to the disciples in this place, "Who do people say that I am then?" And Peter says, "Thou art the Christ." And Jesus says, "You've spoken well, Peter. This hasn't come from your own heart and your own lips. This has been revealed to you by the Holy Spirit." Now that in itself is significant. That in itself is a momentous occasion. And it talks about the keys of the kingdom after that. But the one that we miss so often, it's also when Jesus says to him, "If that's so, Peter, then you need to take up your cross and you need to follow me." It's the first time that Jesus shares that with the disciples that are there. First time, in fact, it says, don't tell anybody about this for the moment, but recognize you need to take up your cross and follow me. It may be that your past is your cross. It may be that your failings and weakness of what's gone on before is the cross that you are called to carry. If so, carry it with grace, because it doesn't mean that God's finished with you. In fact, what it says is that God can take our past and he can use it to his glory and honor. For we all have a story to tell of failures and fears and anxieties. But Jesus says, if you love me, if you have an intentionality about that love that's not to do with feeling warm and fuzzy and glowy and nice, if it is that love is a decision that you have made to love, it becomes a verb. I have decided to love. Then you have a future. In a few moments, we're going to share together in taking bread and wine. Many years, I have a really good friend. In fact, they've been not only a friend, they've been in many ways my spiritual mentor. They've been the person that I go to frequently to converse with them and to share the journey of faith that I'm in. They are a wise individual beyond words that I can express. So you can imagine my surprise when they were visiting me one day on a Sunday. In fact, it was a Christmas they were with me for, and so they came to Christmas Eve communion with me. Now, in the church to which they belong, they don't practice communion. It's not part of their routine at all. And so they came along with me, and there weren't many of us. We sat in a circle and we passed bread and wine to each other, and it was a lovely Christmas Eve experience. So when we got home, I said to Harry, "Well, what do you think?" And he said to me, "Didn't feel anything at all." And what surprised me is that he thought that somehow he should feel something in communion. Now, occasionally maybe we do, but the reality is taking bread and wine isn't about feeling something. It's not about expecting a nice little emotional response, that somehow I've taken this little chunk of bread and I've swallowed it, I feel all nice and warm and glowy inside. What it is a moment when I decide that I'm going to recognize what God has done for me in Christ that I couldn't do for myself. For me, that's at the heart of communion. It's not just about receiving. It's about recognizing. It's about, in that moment, however bad I feel about myself, however sort of poxy week I've had, however awkward it's been, actually God has done for me something that I could never do for myself. And my response to that is in the final words when we share communion, which is, go out with love and serve him in the power of the Spirit. It's about the decision I make, not an emotional feeling that I have. And I think that as Jesus spoke with Peter on that lake shore, on that day, I pray that he's spoken to us too this morning. And that we know the answer when he says, do you love me? And I'm going to say, absolutely I do. And I'm going to live my life with a love that never fails, because it's not about what I feel, but it's about what I know. And so as we prepare ourselves for communion, we're going to sing together. Lovely song that the worship team have chosen for us this morning. My Jesus, my Saviour.